Welcome to In Conversation with the Safety Collaborators. I am Karin.
And I am Nuala. Whether you're a safety professional, a leader, or an individual committed to making a difference,
we invite you to join the discussion on creating a culture of safety and care, enabling your team and leaders to design a safer and more productive and collaborative world. What are the consequences of just getting on with it, even when your instinct is telling you otherwise? Today we are joined by Joe, who will share his extraordinary story of survival and resilience. Joe Meanen is one of the 61 survivors and individuals who made it out of the Piper Alpha disaster alive back in 1988. I will let Joe share the rest of that story, but here is a snippet of something that I found in The Scotsman, which was published on the 5th of July 2018. Joe Meanen was out of options as he looked over the side of the Piper Alpha into the North Sea. A second explosion had just ripped through the doomed platform, a giant fireball now on the move. For those who are unfamiliar about the Piper Alpha tragedy, it was a pivotal moment in offshore safety history, and Joe's experiences that he will share with us today and insights will remind us of the stakes involved in high-risk industry. And we're honoured to have him here to share his story and his journey and the lessons he carried with him.
Joe, it is an absolute pleasure to have you join us today, and we are so grateful that you could spend the time with us. And that question that Karin posed, which I think you have posed in the past, is actually where we're going to open this up. So what are the consequences of just getting on with it, even when our instinct is telling us otherwise?
Yeah, unfortunately, no, the consequences can be horrific. And yeah, without possibly speaking up, although back in that time in the North Sea oil industry, we were, I would say, discouraged from speaking up. But if you spoke up too much and became a nuisance and pain in the management's backside, then they would find some kind of easy way to get rid of you. And normally that would have been what they called is not required back. That was the term they used for the people that they didn't kind of get on with, or they were causing too much problems offshore. Mostly people that were quite unionized guys. It was mostly guys that worked offshore back in that days. And on paper, it was 100% men. Yeah, if you caused too much problems, they just found NRB, that was the short of it, not required back, and they would just find an easy way to dismiss you.
I mean, that's quite a scary reality, because when we think about how we are trying to help people speak up now and how we're trying to encourage that people are included and able to learn in these environments, when you're in an environment where you're going, I can feel that something's not quite right, but I don't want that NRB. So I'm going to just keep quiet. I'll get on with it. I'll do whatever is asked of me and, comply with what the expectation is. It must be quite a difficult, but also in many ways quite a terrifying environment to work with. And then ending up with the experience that you had. And that just shows the reality of what happens when we are not in a culture of being able to actually speak up for our safety.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, hindsight's a great thing to have. Yeah, we should have spoke up, especially that final trip on Piper. Up until, and I only started on the Piper Alpha platform in March of 1988. So by the time July came round, that was my 5th trip on Piper. And up until the 5th trip, things were pretty much as normal as they were on other platforms I'd worked on. I'd worked on a number of platforms offshore for different operators, and some were more safety conscious than others. Sometimes it even came down to what OIM was on the platform over your trip, your 2-week trip, and the safety officers, how really conscious they were and how much they could influence what was going on. What I mean by from above, they weren't, they were allowed to do as much as they could, that they wouldn't upset the senior management and affect, the actual production on the platform too much, if that makes sense. But yeah, like I say, Piper was pretty much the same as other platforms right up until that fifth trip. I was on the platform 12 days before the 6th of July. I only had one more shift to work on 7th of July, and I would have been flying home on the 8th of July. So yeah, we just kind of had to suck it up and get on with it, really. If you if you cause too much problems, you wouldn't get your job back again. And back in that day, jobs were quite scarce to come by in the offshore oil industry. And if you got blacklisted, it wasn't just from one platform. It could have been from a number of platforms, just depending on how much a pain in the backside you would be to, the senior management.
And that, I think, is still relevant today, is that
Yeah.
that sense of, I don't want to be a pain in the backside. And that fear of speaking up. And actually, just before we came on this call, I was on an hour session around how do you deal with fear? How do you deal with facing the things that can actually get in your way of whether it's success or being safe, and really dealing with that. But I can't even begin to imagine what it was that you experienced. And I know that there will be many people listening to this podcast who are quite au fait and they know what the story is behind this. But there will be a large portion of our audience who actually don't know what happened. So could you share a little bit about what was it that actually happened, if you're okay and comfortable going into that?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I can share my experience of what happened with myself and some of my colleagues, my work colleagues I was with that night. I'll go ahead and do that. But there's people that were on Piper or people that survived from Piper. There was 61 survivors, and everybody's got a little bit different recollection of what happened on that night, and a little bit of different experiences because they were in different parts of the platform. Some people were working that night, and so they were already outside. But I'll take you through my experience, and obviously it was my experience, and some of my close colleagues I was with shared a similar experience, but they do also recall little bits of the experience differently from I have done, as we've spoke about over the years. But on the 6th of July, it was a Wednesday. Like I said, I was coming to the end of my 2 weeks offshore. I worked 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off, and I had one more shift to work on the Thursday, and we'd be flying home on the Friday morning. So we worked a 15-hour day on Wednesday, the 6th of July. I was sharing a cabin with 3 other scaffolders. That was my job on the platform, a scaffolder. And 2 of the guys I worked directly with, who were sharing a cabin with, the other guy, Billy, he was working with 2 other colleagues. As the day went on, we knew that the cinema was going to be showing a movie called Caddyshack that night. It was a comedy. The 2 guys I worked with and Billy, we decided early on we were going to go and watch that movie that night. And as the day went on, we seen the other guys that worked with us and some of the other guys in the tea shack and such like that worked on the maintenance contract, and let them know what we were doing that night, and we were going to go and watch the movie. It started just after 9 o'clock. So let's say we'd been working a 15-hour shift. So just about 10 to 9, one of the guys that was working with me, Davey, I said, right, Davey, you get away, get a quick shower, because it was a 4-man cabin. We only had one bathroom shower in the 4-man cabin. So Davey went away quickly and got a quick 2-minute shower. Then just about 5 to 9, I says, right, Mike, you get away. He went away, same again. And then just before 9 o'clock myself, I went away to get a quick shower. 2-minute shower, got changed into my comfortable clothes. I put on a pair of tracksuit bottoms and just a polo shirt, and headed along to the cinema, which was through one of the internal corridors in the accommodation module, and you just had to go outside for a couple of steps. It would take you inside to the cinema, so there was no need to put on any protection at all, any overalls or anything. It was just a matter of 2 steps, and that got you into the cinema. So Davey, the first guy that went, he went away to the Bond. That was the shop on the platform, and he picked up some Cokes, Mars bars, Twixes, such like, just some goodies for us. And we got into the cinema, and the guys in the cinema that were showing the movie knew that there was people working till 9 o'clock that night. So what they did is they started the movie just between past and 9, just to let everybody get in that was working. So we got in. It'd been added to the platform, I think, in 1986. So it was one of the more modern social things on Piper, and it was quite a modern cinema, and it held roughly about 40 or so seats it had in the cinema. And it was quite busy that night because it was quite a popular movie. And it was good. We were just in there enjoying the movie, laughing away. The track was good. But just about 45 minutes or so into the movie, you could hear excessive flaring going on outside. The south-east flare boom wasn't too far from the cinema. You could hear excessive flaring going on. And it was brought a silence over the cinema. People were just having a few curious looks, worried looks between each other. And there was maybe 6 or so Occidental guys in there. Same with them guys, a bit curious, a bit worried. But then it subsided, and then the noise started getting up again in the cinema, the laughter and such like. But probably just a minute or so, it started up again, but even more intense. You could actually feel the energy coming through the floor, coming through your seat. And then all of a sudden, there was a huge explosion. The whole platform rocked back and forward. Part of the roof of the cinema fell in. Some of the lighting fell in, but then the lighting failed. It fell into pitch blackness of cinema. So there was a bit of a panic came over the cinema, people screaming, shouting to get out the cinema. But within maybe 10 to 15 seconds, the emergency lighting came on, activated, and it was right, a matter of, right, lads, let's calm down here now. Let's try and get in an orderly fashion, get back out the cinema, back into the main accommodation area. And that's what we done. But there was total confusion, unbeknown to us. And the first explosion, it totally destroyed the control room. The first explosion was over on the west side of the platform in the gas module C. And the actual main control room of the platform was just up above the divide between module C and D. And the power of the first explosion totally destroyed the control room. Therefore, there was no alarms went off. There was no tannoys went out to tell people what to do. So when people aren't getting any information, it was really quite, I wouldn't say panicky, but people didn't know what to do. My kind of first initial thought was to try and get to my muster point, which was where that was my lifeboat station. And all the lifeboats were stationed more to the north end of the platform. That was where the accommodation module was also located. But after going over to the west side of the platform, there was people coming back from there, guys coming back from there saying, no way, you can't get out that way, Joe. Smoke's too intense. And what happened was that the explosion had sent debris through into module B and A, and that was the drilling modules, and it fractured crude oil pipes, which then leaked crude oil, which led to an oil-based fire. And it was thick, black, acrid smoke that caused. So coming back, trying to go over the east side of the platform, there's people saying, no way, you can't get out that way either, it's too thick. So I got separated from the guys I was with in a cinema, and maybe after 4 or 5 minutes wandering back and forward, just bumping into people, asking them what they're doing, where are you going. And the kind of consensus was most people were heading up to the galley area. And the galley area was just below the heli deck, at the top of the platform, at the top of the accommodation module. And the reason people were heading there was it was a designated safe area. It was fireproof and it had a positive airflow. So it was a safe area, and it should have been safe for about 40 to 50 minutes, fireproofed and such like, as I said. And you were always told when I done my survival course before I went offshore, and any renewal ones I'd done as well, your first method of evacuation would be by helicopter. So that's kind of how everybody ended up, or not everybody, but a lot of people ended up in the galley area. As I made my way up to the galley area, and this is maybe 9-10 minutes past 10 now, and the first explosion was just before 10 o'clock. I wasn't really sure what to do. There was actually double doors that took you into the galley, and I was standing at the entrance of the galley, holding the door on the left-hand side open, and I looked in, and there was maybe about 80 or so men in there, and they were all either lying on the floor, leaning on their elbow, or just squatting on the floor, or sitting on the floor with their backs to the wall, more just to keep as low down as they could. All of a sudden, the door on the right-hand side burst open, and a guy come in and he shouted, "Is there anybody here from Bodens?" And Bodens was the actual drilling crew on Piper, done all the drilling on Piper Alpha. Somebody recognised his voice and shouted, "Mark, we're over here, get yourself over here." And that's what he did. So at that point, I thought, well, that's a good idea. And I shouted, "Is there any scaffolders here?" And some of the guys I was with earlier on recognised my voice and shouted, "We're round the back here, Joe." And they were actually almost at the opposite side of the galley. So I had to go through the galley, and as I was stepping over people to get to the far side of the galley, somebody shouted to the OIM, the offshore installation manager, "Colin, tell us what's going on. What are we going to do?" And you could imagine it would be a bit more forcefully than that. And as I look back, unfortunately, the guy, he was just frozen to the spot. He was just staring straight ahead. This is my recollection of what happened. Yeah, he'd been overcome by the situation. There was another senior manager from the platform there, and he said there'd been a mayday sent out, which there had been from the radio room, which was just adjacent to the heli deck, and there should be helicopters here within the next half an hour, 40 minutes to come and pick us up. So I made my way around through some plastic doors into where my colleagues were at that point, and they were the same. They were all sitting on the floor, but they all had wet dish towels over their noses and mouth. And they said, "Joe, you'll get a dish towel up at the sink." So there's these big industrial sinks, and that was for the catering staff to wash all their cutlery and dishes up, at the end of the lunchtime and breakfast time and evening meals and that. And there was a big pile of dry dish towels, and I picked one up and just naturally turned the tap on to try and soak the dish towel. It was only dribbles of water coming out the tap. And I don't know if it was a kind of a defensive thing from myself, not accepting, I'm not even believing how bad a situation we were in. But once I turned that tap on and there was only dribbles of water coming out, I thought to myself, well, there's no power, there'll be no water, there'll be nothing to fight this fire with. God, we're really in a bad situation here now. But there was still water at the bottom of the sink. There was still some residual water lying at the bottom of the sink. So I soaked the dish towel in there and went down and sat with the guys who, most of them were working colleagues of mine. And I says, "Right, guys, do we know what's happening? Does anybody have got any information?" And they said there'd been two of the firefighting team had come up to the back door of the galley. There was a little back door there and a landing area out the back. It was adjacent to the kitchen, and that's where the catering staff would get their supplies delivered, when they came back offshore again in the small quarter containers. He says there'd been two of the firefighting team had come up to the back door there. They had the breathing apparatus on and their PPE. And they were going to see if they could find any escape routes and come back and let us know. But they were never coming back. As we were sitting there, you could hear other small explosions happening. You could hear actually groaning and yawning noises, and which we didn't realise at the time was actually the start, the structure of the platform started to compromise already. This is only 10, 12 minutes into the incident. Therefore, there was windows breaking because as the structure was compromised and twisting, there was windows getting strain put on them and they were fracturing and just breaking. And then that was, of course, letting in more smoke. The emergency lighting had failed by this point. He says, well, if we stay in here, guys, and anything else happens, we'll not be in a position to do anything for ourselves. Why don't we go outside the back door here, go up onto the heli deck and see what we can see for ourselves? And then after maybe just a minute or so discussing that, we says, right, yeah, that's what we're going to do. Let's go. So as we got up to leave, there was 6 guys there was about 20 of us in that group, and there was about 6 guys. There was 6 guys who worked for a communication company. They were upgrading the communications on paper, satellite dishes and such like, and telephone receivers and such like. And they made no signs of moving. I says to one of the guys, because we'd done a lot of work for them, getting them access to wherever they had to work. And I says, are you guys not coming with us? And they looked at each other and they said, no, we've been told to stay, so we're just going to stay. I says, okay, right, good luck to you guys. So we left and got up onto the heli deck. And as soon as we climbed up onto the heli deck, it came apparent straight away there'd be not any helicopters coming close to this platform, never mind trying to land on the platform. The smoke was so intense, just thick black plumes of smoke going hundreds of feet into the air. And the way the sea and the wind was blowing that night, it was from south to north. So if a helicopter had to approach, obviously they approach against the wind, and that was the way the wind was blowing the smoke to the north. So there would have been absolutely no chance, even if a helicopter did manage to land on the platform. You could imagine the panic it would have been for people trying to, crazy. It would have been crazy. So let's say, but it came apart pretty much straight away that there would be no chance any helicopters landing on the platform. So we went along, and the radio room, which was adjacent to the platform, to the heli deck, we climbed up on top of there because that was the highest point on the platform in that area we could get to. And it was kind of, it wasn't taking us above the smoke, but the smoke was coming across in layers. Or if you were on the beach and you were seeing the waves coming in, and every so often there'd be a gap coming in the smoke. So we'd all stand up and grab a breath of fresh air and then go back down. There was about 12 or 14 of us. And also the Tharos, which was our accommodation support vessel for the shutdown of the platform, was off the west side of the platform. And it had moved a bit closer. The Tharos was mainly there for accommodation, but it was also a firefighting vessel, and it had a small 8-bed medical facilities on it also. It was also a dive support vessel also. But it had only one water cannon trained on paper up until that point, and this water cannon was right at the top of one of the crane jibs, and it was fanning back and forward, and it actually caught us on top of this radio room here. That's soaking our clothes and our hair, actually. And I do believe that saved us from being more badly injured. I'll come on to it a little bit later. But then somebody suggested, right, let's go over to the west side of the platform and see maybe the Tharos could move a bit closer. Maybe they lay the crane boom onto the emergency heli deck, because Piper had 2 heli decks. He had the main heli deck and an emergency heli deck. If you look at any of the photographs, and the emergency heli deck was on the west side of the platform, And we got over there. I mean, it was things were getting desperate ideas, really. We were just scrapping for whatever help we could get. And we went over to the west side of the platform and we're waving down at the Tharos. I'm sure obviously they could see us. Say there was 12 or 14 of us. And we just got over to that west side of the platform, and that's when the riser from the top platform fractured the gas riser. And that's when the huge fireball engulfed the platform. Everybody just jumped back the way. We didn't actually know what had happened. You just knew something horrendous had happened. We were all piled on top of each other like a rugby scrum pile up, sort of. And as people got up, they just took off in all different directions. Not another word was spoken between us all. People just took off in all different directions. For some reason, I got up and I kind of headed diagonally across the emergency heli deck, and there was a radio tower adjacent to this heli deck, and I climbed through onto that and started climbing up the internal ladder of the radio mast, and it was absolutely taking me nowhere. It didn't feel like panic. I knew what I was doing. I think it was just trying to get away from what was going on beneath me, and I got so far up and then I slipped, and I thought to myself, well, that's it, I'm dead here. And at that point, something just took over what I was doing. I don't know if it was some higher being looking after me or not, or just a will to live, a survival instinct. I came down the ladder that took you down to the level below the heli deck, run along to the access stairs that you'd use to go up onto the main heli deck if you were going to catch a chopper to take you back home, run over to the north side of the platform, had a look over. That huge fireball had cleared all the thick black smoke away. Could actually see down to the sea. I had a life jacket on at this point, took the life jacket off, threw it in front of me. And although I knew exactly what I was doing, it was almost like an outer body experience. It was like as if some other thing was pushing me to do what I was doing. So I threw this life jacket over the side, knew I could use the supports for the safety netting around the heli deck to propel myself away from the platform, because a few overhanging objects below the heli deck. So I took a bit of a run and used the supports for the safety netting to throw myself off. And as I'd done that, the first thing that came into my head, and don't mean to offend anybody here, but as if I just came back to realization, and I just thought, what the fuck have I done? And then not another thought came into my head till I hit the water. And it took roughly between 5 and 6 seconds to cover that distance, which was 175 feet. So it'd be 54 meters distance. Yeah, then bang, I hit the water. Knew I'd hit the water, obviously still alive. Don't know how far I went down, a bit disorientated, but the light from the fire above gave me a reference to get back to the surface. Got back to the surface, huge big gulp of breath, had a look around in the water. There was a lot of debris in the water. Looked over to my left-hand side and there was a life jacket floating in the water quite close to me. It could only have been the one I threw in front of me. Just put my arm through that, my left arm through that to give me some buoyancy. And like I said earlier, all the lifeboats were stationed at the north end of the platform. At least one of these lifeboats got blown off in the second explosion. And part of the roof of one of them was floating in the water next to me. Also used that for buoyancy and started propelling myself away from the platform. And like I said earlier, the sea and the way the weather was that night, running from south to north, and the sea was running south to north, that was in my favour. The swell and the water was taking me away from the platform also. And it was a lovely calm night. It was a beautiful summer's night, as you often go offshore in the summertime. Not quite flat calm, I would have said maybe half a metre, possibly less than that, swell in the water that night. But it was in my favour, taking me away from the platform, running north. I got so far away and I could see the rest of this shell of a lifeboat floating in the water. And I disregarded the stuff I had and I swam over to the lifeboat, pulled myself up into the lifeboat, sat on the rim of the lifeboat, and I was looking back at the platform, just trying to just trying to remember what I was witnessing. There was huge explosions going on, just a whole, almost like a wall of flame from the sea upwards. And then I was sitting there and I had my hands on my knees, and because I only had a polo shirt on, I looked down and I had these huge blisters on my hands and arms, and I couldn't really figure out what had happened there. But everything was also happening so quickly as well, and I could hear a fast rescue craft in the water, one of these rigid inflatables, and that was heading towards the lifeboat. They got me into, I was heading to the lifeboat and they got me into their fast rescue craft, lay me along the side of the fast rescue craft, and that's when my injuries started taking effect on me and my adrenaline had subsided a bit. And for the next, I think it was the next half an hour, 40 minutes, I was in and out of consciousness. I do remember them vaguely maneuver me into a stretcher so they could winch me onto their supply boat. And then a bit later on, I remember the lights from the crane, because they just actually craned the stretcher, the rigid stretcher, straight from the supply boat onto the Tharos. And by that point, this is maybe 40 minutes or so later, quarter to 11, maybe 11 o'clock, somewhere in between that time, there'd been medical people arrived out from the Aberdeen or some of the other platforms. I do remember them taking me into the hospital facilities on the Tharos, and I was going into shock at that point. I was shivering and just, losing control. And I just remember one of the medics or the doctor saying he needs a shot of morphine. And I remember getting that in the left cheek of my bum, and I could feel it spreading across my body. And then they bandaged me up or whatever as best they could, and they just put me somewhere with somebody looking after me until it was time for me to get the helicopter back to Aberdeen to get to the hospital. So, that was it. I do remember getting to the hospital. I think it was a Royal Navy helicopter that took me back, but I can't really be sure. But I do remember getting into the accident emergency area of the hospital, and it just seemed like total confusion, it was just, but I'm sure it was organised confusion, you know what I mean? But there'd been a number of helicopters arrive with people that were injured. And then kind of after that, the next thing I remember, I was up in a ward, and I had been told that my mum and my sister had been notified, and where I live wasn't too far from Aberdeen, just about 20 kilometres, 15 miles or so south of Aberdeen, and they'd been notified that there had been obviously a disaster, but I was one of the survivors. Didn't know how I was or anything, but they were heading into Aberdeen to just, obviously see me. So I just kept myself going till they arrived. I didn't really know how badly I was injured either myself, but I just kept myself going till they arrived. And then over the next 2 or 3 days, it was just a bit of a blur. There was things going on. I had all bits and pieces going in and out of me. And, I was I had oxygen on a drip, house catheter. They was pumping painkillers into me all the time, I feed for just give me painkillers. So like I say, the 2 or 3 days after that was like just a bit of a blur in the ward till we, started to recover. I do remember the first 2 evenings there was a nurse stationed at our bedside just to make sure, just in case anything, went wrong during the evening. But yeah, we progressed and we got better, and things became I don't know if better's the way, but became more realizing of what the situation was, and then just actually just so lucky to be alive. My injuries didn't seem to be actually of any great consequence at that point, but just so happy to be alive when you started getting some information. It was only myself and another survivor, Roy Carey, that were in a ward on our own. Myself and Roy were two of the more badly burnt survivors.
Hmm.
Some of the other guys were in another ward.
I mean, I've heard this before, and it still doesn't change a thing. The feelings that even listening to that story, having a vague understanding of what it's like to be in an emergency situation or in a disaster situation, those feelings, the emotions, the sheer terror, and it'll be different for different people. And I'd be curious as to when people are listening to this, what's actually going on for them as they sit through this story when people are listening. I can't even imagine. But the good thing is that you're here to tell it.
Yeah. Very fortunate still to be here. And I don't mind Karen sharing my story. And I think we've discussed it before, and
Yeah.
it helps, if it helps make a difference for, mostly people that work offshore or whatever, but obviously in other industries as well, chemical plants, oil refineries, oil terminals, mining industries, heavy engineering. There's similarities between them all,
We do a lot in the safety space to help people have better mindsets and all sorts of things. But these sorts of events are much bigger. They didn't just happen on that day. There's a lot of moments leading up to the moment. And it could have been over a period of months, if not years, of way of doing things, of behavioral patterns, of leadership or not. That, coming back to what we said at the beginning around people being able to speak up about just their instincts, which, back in the 80s, it's not something that you did in any industry, really. And you went to work, and if you didn't like it, well, be quiet about it and get on with it. And so I think something that's very good in this day and age is that we're starting to really recognize that shift that has to happen. When I've ever used this example in workshops, not the direct story, obviously, but the Piper Alpha event in itself, I often ask people, what is the one thing that could have made a lot of difference long before the explosions and everything happened? And it's always interesting, the answer. So I've got to ask you that question. What do you think, before everything started to go wrong, what do you think is the one thing that should have happened?
Well, it's like you said, Karen, built up over years. I
Mm,
mean, the health and safety legislation that applied onshore never ever applied offshore. The government
mm,
was against, the operators were against, the unions tried to push it. There was no union recognition at all offshore. The government at the time had just been through their battle with the miners in the kind of late 70s, mid to late
in,
70s.
mm,
The workers had to be listened to.
yeah.
It's just, and it wasn't happening. And it wasn't, I mean that from the guys who cleaned the rooms, the catering staff, the stewards that cleaned the rooms, cleaned the bathrooms, to the men all the way up to the top on the platform. I'm sure
Mm,
they must have reservations about things as well, but they weren't willing to speak up enough
no,
about it either.
yeah. And I think that's a really good, poignant point. It isn't about any one person or role or responsibility. It's something that is suffered across the board, that inability to speak up or that inability to be vulnerable, which is where this whole conversation around psychological safety comes into play. How do we help everybody be okay with their vulnerability? And sometimes that's just saying hello in a meeting. It doesn't have to be even more complicated than that,
Mhm.
especially if it's a new environment. for a person?
Mhm.
Yeah, there's some great couple of good questions here, or thoughts that Knowles has written down as well. Coming back to the event itself, what were some of the key changes that happened as a result of that event and then the ensuing Cullen report, the outcome of the Cullen report? What do you think were the key things, and are we doing them today?
Yeah, well, I think the real first one was the realization through the whole oil industry, wow, this can't happen. I think whether they ignored it, turned a blind eye to it, willfully ignored it, it came obviously evident in this huge disaster that this can happen. And I think it opened everybody's eyes up to, you know, well, this can't happen.
Mm.
The second part. Sorry, what was that again, Carl?
Well, have we learned the lessons
Have we learned? Yes, yeah, that's right. Have we learned? Sorry.
or implemented? Even more important.
Yeah, I think there is, but also as times went by, I mean, it's great. I go in and speak to a number of companies, and there's been a few of the high profile or the top companies have had me in quite a bit. But it's the other companies that don't take you in. You know what I mean? And things can be tight. Margins can be tight for smaller companies. They're getting squeezed sometimes from the top as well. And yeah, and there'll always be people, that will maybe try to cut corners. And I use Grenfell as an example in my presentation. And when the government eased the legislation on building work legislation, and it was self-regulated, there was people cutting corners there, saving money, total confusion. When emergency services turned up at Grenfell, they didn't even know what material was getting used as cladding, and it was only fire-resistant cladding. It wasn't fireproof cladding. There was people making cutbacks, and that was obviously a bit more modern. But back in the day, and I spoke about this, people back in the day, and it wasn't just with Piper, but if you think back to the 80s, there was so many things happening in the UK, and there was King's Cross was one of the things, this fire at King's Cross. There was also the first one I remember, and I think it was shown when I done my survival course, was the fire at the Bradford football stadium. You had trains crashes at Clapham Junction, I think it was, and you had Zeebrugge also, and you had Lockerbie, totally different thing. That was the same year as Piper, and then you had Hillsborough the year after that. There was people back then making decisions, and I think this includes the post office and the blood transfusion scandal as well. There was people making decisions back then with impunity, thinking they would never be held account, because most of them will have passed away now, that they won't be held accountable, but they were making decisions back then, like I say, with impunity and no real sort of being held accountable for it.
Accountable, yeah. Interesting. I'm going to take you back to something is, there's the smaller companies that might not take you in for a whole range of reasons. But interestingly, so many of these events around the world are big organizations. They're not small ones. You think Texas City, you think Bhopal, you think, Longford, there's Macondo, right? These are all still these big, big events that happen. And, maybe that is where we need to think more deeply about, I'm going to say, leadership decisions, the finance, who's running the business. Is it finance, or is it getting the job done safely and efficiently? We talk a lot about the cost of not doing business safely. Yeah. What are the consequences of, and I'm not suggesting that people do this always intentionally. Sometimes they think they're doing the right thing for the business or the operation or for it's not always with bad intent, and probably often not with bad intent, except when you can see organizations truly cutting corners, as in the case of Grenfell. Then it's a little more obvious. And sadly, that story is still going on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
can't imagine anybody will be held accountable for that,
No.
because I think
No.
it's just going round in circles. Yeah, I mean, you're right, Karen. It is big organisations, but there's so many subcontractors come in, and I have some of the things I've been at, and I'll not mention any names, but they've been asking me, how do we get this message over to our contractors? How do we get the message of safety over to them? And well, I just try to say, well, you just have to get them engaged more, and even, I've said at times, ask them to come up and do a presentation for safety. You don't preach to them all the time. Get them involved. Get somebody
Yeah.
coming up from
Mm.
different contractors and share with them what you're wanting to do, and let them, it's not the easiest thing to do in the world,
No, it's
but,
not. Yeah.
and just try to get everybody, and then kind of give an example, because you don't want any elitists on these platforms can only speak about, because everybody's on there together. And I say, well, if you go on an airplane, and it doesn't matter if you turn left when you go on, turn right, to go where you're sitting, if that plane gets into problems or trouble, you're all in it together, might be the same with a ship as well, you know what I mean? But,
It is.
and,
Yeah.
so just try to
Yeah.
do that analogy on a platform. That you're all in it together,
Mm.
and
Mm.
everybody has to work together.
Mm.
Uh, Safety, your machinery working on the platform. Piper had a defective deluge system.
Mm.
It was Lloyd's of London had done an audit on it in 1986. It was condemned. Occidental protested against that, and put objection in for that, and they got a 2-year exemption. The government back in that day and the oil companies were pretty much working hand in hand, because
Mm.
back then, Karen, it was the Department of Energy that overseen health and safety offshore. So they obviously had a conflict of interest. And Lord Cullen's report,
Highlighted that. Yeah.
highlighted that and
Yeah.
said and advised it should be the health and safety executive that
Mm.
who was in charge of health and safety offshore, which did happen.
Mm.
Uh, just about all the recommendations were taken up by the oil companies, but I'm sure a few of them have,
I think one of the things that we talk about is that immunity. We become immune, we become a little bit complacent, we get a little too comfortable. We get that sense of, this won't or can't happen to us again. That was then, now is now. There is, I'm sure, there's this array of thoughts and emotions and conflicts, I think, in terms of getting business done versus, I'm thinking of the blue money rules, that money where what do we need to spend to not make that happen? But it's a very difficult conversation because people don't know why they're spending it yet until it happens.
yes.
And how do we help people to realize that if they put in, I'm just going to use small numbers here to make this a little bit, if in the case of the cost of an event like that, well, it was enormous for individuals, for the operations, for everything. But let's come back down to smaller size events, where there's a recovery process. Let's say something costs £1 million in costs in the event, costing the business money. Had they've maybe spent £100,000, they would have saved 900,000. But they don't look at it from that perspective because there's shareholders and there's price indexes and all sorts of other things that get involved into the conversation, which should never be ignored. They're part of doing business. But how do we get people to be more proactive in recognizing the cost, I suppose?
Very much that. But you said something earlier as well, and it just made me think of context, because all of this is around context. So whether it is the context of the organizational culture, the way things are done around here, and that flows right through to the contractors. And when we have a certain way of doing things. And I remember, I cannot remember the woman's name from BP, but there was the example of one of their electrical contractors, and they kept getting an arc on this particular piece of equipment, and they just kept firing the electrical contractors and getting another one in, and firing the next one and getting another one in. And eventually they found out that actually they hadn't given the contractors the correct drawings. So the fault wasn't on the contractor. The fault was actually on the organization. And kudos to her, because she actually went back to all the previous contractors and apologized and said, this is what's happened. But they walked away with this massive, failure against them, whereas they're trying to do the job. And I think that happens in a lot of times. So, Kaz, going back to what you were saying about being proactive, we don't want to acknowledge that the devil never sleeps. And there's a brilliant book about crisis management called The Devil Never Sleeps. And we're not having those really hard conversations of what could be going wrong in our systems. How are we not communicating? How are things slipping through the cracks? Because we all have that superhero feeling of it. It won't happen to us. When I get behind the steering wheel of a car, I'm not imagining that I'm going out to have an accident. I'm imagining that I'm going out to have a safe day. I'm going to have a good drive. I'm going to come home and I'm going to have a safe day. And if I'm questioning all the time, I'm also going to be exhausted. So we can't constantly be living in fear and questioning. But maybe we need to find a balance of questioning and being a little bit harder on ourselves around the context that we're in, holding the mirror up and going, what do we need to be differently or need to be doing differently so that people don't have to learn from their own mistakes?
Yeah. The consequences of those mistakes.
Mm.
I do believe, and it's not happened for years and years, and it should have happened if people or managing directors, CEOs, if it taken all the way back to them, if they were held accountable and taken to court, charged with either manslaughter, death caused by reckless decisions, however that would go down. I think that would have filtered through many managing directors and CEOs and senior management of companies across the board, that would maybe make them think twice about maybe taking that little extra gamble.
In so many industries and other arenas like politics, but that's for another day.
Yes.
But it's such a good thing because that is part of that holding that mirror, is that the decisions that are being made from the very top, whether it is the way that your cleaning staff are treated, that culture runs all the way through. So it's the small things, and it probably sounds a bit harsh, but I judge people on how they treat service staff. So when I go to a restaurant or go anywhere where there's service staff and I'm around people who have disdain or they're just there to serve me, I question it, because I go, well, if that's how you are in this aspect of your life, what do you like in the rest of your life? How are you treating the people, the work environment? What message are you sending as to whether people have value? Because if we don't feel we have value, we're not going to speak up. We're going to just sit back. And we're not going to be able to create safer work environments. So I think there's a huge responsibility for people who are in leadership positions. And I think that is becoming more and more, especially, with the updated like ISO 45001. I mean, I can see it even here in South Africa. There has been one CEO who has been taken to court, and it's created, quite a ripple effect of, gosh, actually, we are responsible. Yes, because it starts from there and then ripples through the business.
Yeah. It's both a legal and a moral obligation. And I think that word obligation is a much better one than accountability and responsibility. Because if we're obligated to do something, then that's much more personal. You're going to say...
Just one example, and it's kind of along that lines, but it's not. It's in April of '88, we found out, I think it was my second trip on Piper. We found out there was a new maintenance contractor who would be coming in and taking over the maintenance contractor. So there was about 90 men between all the different trades, the pipe fitters, the welders, platers, riggers, the scaffolders, the painters. We were all under the umbrella of a maintenance contract. And we found out that there was a rumour going about at first. And then we found out, the new maintenance contractor coming in. And we were told, all the guys that were, that our jobs were safe and we'd carry on as we were. The only thing we had to do was change the colour of our overalls, but also we had to take a pay cut from £5.20 an hour to £4.90. And it was obviously quite a bit more back then, but it was the effect it had on morale on the platform. It was just like really devastating right across the platform. And it would have been about £65, £67, depending how many hours you worked your 2 weeks offshore. And back then, that did pay a fair bit of my mortgage back then. But it was just the effect. And people were saying, well, we are getting treated like shit. Why? And it was subconscious. I go back to this quite a bit. Subconsciously, a huge effect on the men. But it wasn't just on Piper that was happening. It was happening all over the North Sea because the oil price had crashed back in 1985, I think it was, or something. And it was, obviously a great way of saving money for the oil companies. Like I say, it happened across the board in the North Sea. But it's huge effect it had on morale on the platform. And I say subconsciously it had a great effect on people.
Without a doubt.
And I think we've experienced that in other situations as well, where people don't consider when they're going to send a message. And especially for people who are working in remote, whether it's offshore, mining, getting a message of uncertainty, right before Christmas. What effect and impact that has. Because somebody's been told they need to send a message out and they just go, oh, okay, well, it's the 21st of December. I need to send the message. I'm sending it. Not going, could we hold off on this? Or at least give people a heads up. I remember the one vessel I was working on and they got some really bad news, just like literally the day before Christmas. And I was incredibly impressed with the OIM because he just kind of shut everything down, got everybody in talking, like, how are you feeling about this? What can we do about it? Because he had had a previous experience that had resulted in quite a bad incident because of the emotional state of the people that he was working with. And he was like, I'm not repeating that. So let's just get everybody on an even keel, even if it means we shut down for 6 hours.
Oh. That's learning from his previous experience, and definitely, it's hugely significant for the people at the lower end of the pay scale, probably.
I think, we talk about emotional intelligence and, people say don't get emotional, but all of those things are about emotions. And we need to help people understand what those things are. And hence the conversation around mental health, although I prefer mental fitness and what can we do before we get to that point. And all of these elements that we've just, considerations, are part of that conversation. It isn't any one thing. So, to kind of wrap this up, we often like to ask the magic question. And that would be if you could money was no object, or time or money was no object. If you could have one miracle that would change the way that we do business, let's say in the offshore industry or in health and safety for the offshore industry, or that would impact safety culture, what would it be? What would you love to see?
I've never had that question before. Yeah, what would I like to see? I don't know, I think you've got me there.
Karin, it's a really good question when you need time to process and think.
Absolutely. Well, let me ask a slightly different question.
Yeah, right. Let's try it.
What's something that you feel that does need to still be implemented today that maybe they haven't done so well yet?
Well, obviously, especially in RC now, we're getting older assets, and the one thing I believe that would have helped us tremendously on that night, Karen, would have been if we had a fully functional deluge system. And unfortunately, that night, and this happened all through the summertime, the OIM, his decision was to put the deluge system on manual, and it wasn't on automatic, because there was divers in the water from Piper every night during the summertime, not unless the weather was too bad or whatever. But I believe it would have saved a lot more lives that night if we had a proper, fully functional deluge system, even if it was working at 75% and it had been probably switched on. As far as I'm aware, it was the OIM's decision that it was on manual. Even if it was on automatic, like I said, it wasn't fully functional anyway. It wasn't even 50%, I don't think. But at least it might have been something. It could have kept everything cooler, possibly for a bit longer on a platform. It would have maybe suppressed the smoke, dampened down the oil-based fire a bit. But that would have been the biggest thing. It would have helped us that evening. Proper, a fully functional safety system in all platforms,
Yeah.
as near to 100% as possible.
And maybe just I'm going to add some words to this, and maybe adding to that would be helping those in positions of decision making, helping them to be better at it and making better choices. So how do we help? Maybe it's about let's continue learning and helping that leadership and the decision making process to be more in favor of getting it right more often. And maybe that would be the miracle thing, whether it's maintenance, making people feel safe to speak up, whether it's, following or being open to being challenged for a procedure that might not be working as well as it once did. So maybe that is the miracle we're all looking for in any situation.
100%. The people that are in charge of the maintenance guys, the drilling guys, the well control guys, let them have their decisions and give them the equipment, the stuff they need to do their job properly.
Yeah.
I want to add to that and encourage people to ask the question of what are we not seeing, or what do we not want to see in this situation? Because especially when we think of the industries we're in, it's industries where you have to be making quick decisions. And, Kaz, if we go back to personality diversity, people who are fast-paced make a decision, it's my way or the highway, I've come up with an idea, we're just going to go with it. And then people just go, okay, well, you're the boss, we're going to go with it. There's a chain of command. And how do we create places where it's safe to actually challenge and go, what are we not seeing in this decision? Because it might sound like a good idea, but if all we have are followers and we don't have challenges, we may be missing an entire area that goes, well, if we have the deluge system on manual, these are the potential consequences. But I haven't thought of those because I don't want to see what could go wrong. I just want to see what is right in the idea that I've come up with. And that's tough. That's a hard challenge.
It is. Yeah. Food for thought for those.
Absolutely.
For us and for those who will get the joy of listening to this. And we really hope that by Joe sharing his story, that makes us think and constantly be brought to the realities of when it goes horribly wrong. And also, what are we doing when we're in that situation? How do we make something not be as horribly wrong? For example, making sure that systems, etc., are in place. Because I think it would be naive to think that nothing will ever go wrong. That's not being safe. It's how we manage, how we discuss, how do we be proactive and lead from the future instead of from behind.
Yeah, 100%. And I would say that was one of my biggest regrets from my time back offshore that I didn't appreciate how dangerous a situation I was working in myself. You always thought, no, it'll never happen to me. It's going to happen. It'll happen when somebody else is. I'll be on shore, or and it's just that basic mentality, and maybe men are sometimes worse at it than others, thinking, no, bravado, it'll never happen to me.
Well, I think that's just called welcome to being a human being and humanity. But otherwise we would never get much done, if we didn't sort of believe a little bit that it's not going to happen to me. It's just how far do we push that button? So thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So how can people reach out to you? Where's the best place for people to come and reach out to you if they want you to speak at their workplace or event? We will put this into the show notes as well, just for those that are listening.
LinkedIn's probably the best way to get in contact with me.
Okay.
I've got my profile up on LinkedIn, and if anybody wants to send me a message through LinkedIn, I'm quite happy to give them any information they need, and we can take it from there.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today. It is always lovely to have conversations that matter. To learn more about creating a culture of safety and care, please visit our website, safetycollaborations.com, to access our show notes, resources, and guides. Leave us a message via the Message Us section on the show notes page, and we'll get back to you.
You can also join our community on social media by following us on our LinkedIn pages, Safety Collaborations, Karin Ovari and Nuala Gage, and on our new Safety Collaborations social channels, YouTube, Facebook and Instagram. Our handle Safety Collaborations is much the same. Sharing is caring. Follow us on your favourite podcast platform. Leave us a 5-star review would be awesome. Doing these things helps us to grow and share our collective conversations. Till next time,
stay safe
and stay well.
Thank you.